just to sort of give the usual kind of plug, I don't have it with me, but we have various publications that have arisen from this seminar series, most recently a special issue of the Bulletin of the Institute of Classical Studies, edited nicely in time for last year's ref by Simon and myself, which is available, well, I don't know from all good bookshops, but from the more middle market ones anyway. So I don't think we have any fire alarms or anything scheduled, so I will just crack on and introduce my two long-standing friends and colleagues, Elton and Leif Isaksen, who have, this is not the first time they've appeared in the Digital Classicist seminar.
Are you trying to say something?
They always have something new and interesting to say every single year, which I certainly don't, so there we go. So, Pelagios and Recogito, annotation platform for joining a linked data world. So about 45 minutes then.
We'll aim for that.
We'll do, yeah.
Well, it's going to be a double act. I'm the straight guy, obviously. Thank you very much, Stuart. Thanks everybody for coming, people on the internet and everything. So, we'll be talking about mainly Recogito today, which is an annotation platform. That's of use for discovering places in documents, both text and maps. But to give a little bit of context, we thought it might be useful to give a little bit of information about Pelagios first. So the first few slides will be basically where we've been for the last 3 or 4 years, and then the majority of the talk will be about Recogito, this kind of annotation platform that anybody can use. And then the last, probably third, will also be looking at new ways of trying to make use of that information. So what's the point of annotating your documents? So hopefully some new stuff there. And of course, from the outset, we should say that this is not just us two, this kind of collaboration, but there are a couple of other guys important. Rainer Simon of the Austrian Institute of Technology, Vienna, and Soto from Southampton. And as you'll also see, there are lots of partners. So Adios is very much, again, a collaborative project. But to start with, what do we mean by Pelagios? So before we get to the Recogito bit, well, there's all this stuff on the web that I'm sure you're aware of. There's, I'm basically, my day job is as a classicist, dealing with texts, home underwater, so I'm very much in the kind of the text bubble over there. But there's a lot of other information out there on the web. In a library environment, it'd be easy for me to understand where to find information about important cultural information, context for reading my texts. In the web, it's much more difficult to discover where this information is. So Pelagios is very much a kind of discovery project, enabling you to find out information that's going to enrich your reading of whatever particular material you're looking at, whether that's text, or inscriptions, or archaeological finds. And so far, we have over 45 partners from 10 countries, and this surprising figure of 1 million annotations. So we'll come to this, what we mean by annotations.
Rounded figure.
Yes, around it. Yeah. It's 1,000,001 now, I think. Basically, the principle of Pelagios is linking together the places of the past through the documents we refer to them. And again, what we're talking about the past, we're mainly going to be talking about the ancient world to begin with, but as you'll see, the latest project we've been working on moves beyond the ancient world. It's now confined to Greece and Rome. So that's kind of exciting too. So it's kind of goes beyond just the idea of antiquity. Now, this slide is kind of right and kind of not right. Yeah, well, okay, I obviously kind of nod to Christopher Lee here with the one ring to all them all, which Pelagios isn't. So it's not about trying to make everybody aggregate their data in a particular way or have a standard data representation. Our model is very lightweight regarding what the kind of annotation that you're providing for your particular data. It's not also about, we're not the place to come to either. It's not some kind of mega search portal for discovering stuff about the ancient world. Up to a point. So what you'll see in the last third, which is kind of the exciting edgy bit, and that Rainer, our lead developer, promised us not to give away the URL, because it doesn't work properly yet, is a search portal, which it kind of gives you a sense of the kinds of things you can do once you've hooked up to the Pelagios network. So this slide is already becoming a little bit out of date. But the principle really remains the same of trying to decentralize what we're doing so that other people can build on what we're doing, building on our efforts.
Should say yes. So everything we show, even the search portal, is really it's to stimulate and make people think about what linked data, which again, semantic web technologies might enable us to do, and it certainly isn't intended to replace other services out there or inhibit people developing them.
So how does Pelagios work? This is a familiar slide. We'll pass over this quite quickly. This is again my familiar world, text of Herodotus. Two places in there that I understand as places. They are Athens and Sparta. As a computer though, just looking at a character string, it doesn't understand that ATHENS is Athens. It doesn't understand the concept. So what we do here, what really is the glue behind Pelagios, is to use these kind of codes. I think these have been called social security numbers by somebody in the audience, and this is quite a useful way to think about these places. So these are coming from a kind of central authority file, a Gazetteer, a database of places called Pleiades, online Gazetteer, and by using these codes instead of the character string ATHENS, we can discover these places. Computers can do this, and that you can then start linking together documents across the web using this kind of model. So yeah, it's a way of really joining together these two different knowledge worlds. So you've got the Gazetteer knowledge world of places, and lots of information to do with places, and links between those places. You also have the world of documents and links between those documents. And really what Pelagios does is to enable these two worlds to come together and start linking between them. So now you can discover connections between places through the documents that refer to them, or vice versa. You can discover connections between documents through the places that they refer to. That in about 5 minutes is Pelagios. Do you want to add something?
Oh, it's just the fact that we can even go a step further. We can even find documents which relate to other documents because of those places, and we can find relationships between places because they're referred to in common documents. We can keep exploring that graph.
So that's what we've been doing. That's kind of what we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years. For the last year or so, we've been funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to go beyond the ancient world. So would you like to take
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so yes, the basic premise then of Pelagios is how do we connect documents and places together. Pelagios 3 and Pelagios 4 are two projects, one funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, one by the AHRC, which are looking at extending beyond the classical world the kinds of documents that we can refer to and the kinds of places that we can refer to. And that introduces a whole range of issues. So some of those are what gazetteers can we use. We've already heard about Pleiades, which is a well-established gazetteer which gives us URIs for places in the ancient world. But of course, once we start moving beyond that, the classical world in time, then we need other gazetteers, and to some degree also in space. So as we start moving into Asia in the periods that we're looking at. The other is scale. There are obviously lots and lots of documents out there. Just by looking at the ancient world, we have a somewhat more tractable kind of data set. But clearly, the further on we go, the more documents that we need to look at. So what we were wondering was, is there a particular place that we could focus that would enable us to produce a kind of core body of content to connect to, which would also mean that other people who annotated their content would automatically start getting gains just by that annotation process. And we already saw that really the power of Pelagios is that growing graph. It's the connections between things. So that leads us to what you might call the first train station or the first telephone problem. And telephones and train stations are wonderful, but it's not a lot of fun if you're the only person who has one. So, the purpose of Pelagios 3 is to give a kind of core body of material in other periods and other places people can link to. What kinds of documents might have lots of references to places on them? We thought very long, we thought very hard about that, and then we suddenly realized, maps. Maps have lots of place references in them, and geographic documents, geographic texts tend to have places. So Pelagios 3 and Pelagios 4 are focusing on tools, and also the process of annotation of early geographic documents, and that's both maps and text that talk about places, talk about geography, up to 1492, when the picture gets a little bit more complicated. So here we go, here's Visconti's world map, and just as a taster of what's about to come, here's Visconti's world map with a bunch of annotations on it, and we'll come to exactly what those annotations mean in a moment.
And in many ways, just to go back to that image, it's really about trying to read maps and text alongside each other as well. Once you've annotated the place names in text and you've annotated place names in maps, then you can start reading these two fantastic resources alongside each other, saying some kind of dialogue. So this is what Recogito looks like.
Yes, so the first, Pelagios 1 and Pelagios 2, the first Pelagios projects, we were working with partners and we developed a kind of cookbook that enabled us, that really through a collaborative spirit helped people who might also have a bit of technical background take data sets which were pre-existing and produce these Pelagios annotations for them. With Recogito, what we want to do is produce a platform that means that you don't have to have that kind of technical expertise. That anybody could take a particular text or a particular image and start that annotation process and start linking things together and producing these annotations so that we can start exploiting them in a variety of different ways. So to be able to do that, if you recall, there are two parts to an annotation. It's bidirectional. We have a target, we have a reference to a particular place in a text or an image, and we have a body, which is the reference to the place in the Gazetteer. Okay? So whatever we want to do, we've got those two separate tasks for each annotation. So Recogito is a platform that enables us to do that. There's a number of specific kind of web interfaces that allow us to do certain kinds of things. So this is really the front end, this is what you come to first, and this is a kind of catalog page which tells us which texts or which images, which documents we've been annotating.
And this is public view.
This is a public view. So one thing we should clarify straight out of the gate, remember we are annotating documents from the web. So we want things that have got URIs, but we don't own the copyright to all of those texts. And that introduces issues about the production of an annotation is in and of itself not breaching any kind of copyright any more than buying a book and writing something in the margins of doing it. That's perfectly fine. But taking that book and copying it and then redistributing it to everybody else, of course, is a breach of copyright. So that means that what we're doing with Recogito is enabling people to annotate content, but they are not simultaneously publishing anything other than the annotations. So if you want to see the document, you have to go back to the original site itself. Recogito is not a portal, if you will, or it's not a sort of superstore of documents where you can kind of come and rummage around. It's a mechanism for you to discover content which is elsewhere. So these are a variety of different documents which exist, again, on the web somewhere. We have ways of kind of classifying those. So this is quite an early screenshot, actually. But here we have a Latin and a Greek tradition. We now also have a variety of others, including Islamic and Chinese and maritime and early Christian. Here we have the list, which can also have authors and dates. It starts to get a bit more interesting over on the right-hand side, where we have the number of targets, so how many place references have been identified within that text. And this green and yellow bar here gives an indication of how many of those targets we were able to geo-resolve, how many of those targets we could tie to a particular place in the Gazetteer, and how many, for one reason or another, we were unable to geo-resolve.
So the bar's doing a couple of things. It's first of all showing the number of annotations that there might be, and the green aspect of it shows whether someone has looked at it and verified it. So it's a claim that, that this particular set of annotations have been fully marked up.
There's also a couple of buttons here where we can look at a map. We can actually look at a kind of Google-style map and see the various places which have been identified within a particular document. And you can also download those annotations as well, and we'll come to this later on, if you wanted to import it into a spreadsheet or a database.
So this is the public aspect. So this remains open, so anybody can download the map or view the map in a web browser or download information about the annotations. But to work on the annotations themselves and to get to the documents, you've got to log in. So that's the keys to the kingdom. So once you're inside, you get to see something like this. This is, again, a kind of familiar world for me. It's a text of Herodotus. And you go through the text, there's a couple of icons in the top left there I'll come back to in a second. But basically, you go through the text, you notice You think this is a place, Mikale, you click on it, then you ask whether you would like to mark Mikale as a toponym, press OK, it's then marked. A couple of additional things. So that's the kind of the pencil icon. There's also next to it is a rocket, a kind of rocket mode, and we've been testing this with students, and you'll see those tests later. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But we found that students really like the rocket mode, obviously. What you don't get is the warning pop-up box. You're confident enough to say colophon is a place, you click on it, double click on it, bang, there you go. Something else will happen though, so that if you click on, for example, colophon and it says, and you've got this warning pop-up, you want to mark this as a toponym, you go OK. Another pop-up box might appear saying, there are other instances of colophon in this text, would you also like to mark those up? So again, this is trying to make the process of annotation as simple as possible. And I guess it's kind of useful to mention that we initially thought this was going to be automated. Is that right? Because we were thinking of kind of work that we've previously done on the Google Ancient Places project, where we've been doing kind of automated geoparsing. And we came to the conclusion quite quickly that it's just easier to make this really simple than to do it automated and then you having to go back through it and clean it up. Because at the best, we were probably getting an 80% precision and recall. So you'd still have to go through it anyway and check that the places that you're indicating or the annotation you're making as places are correct. You then have to go through the process anyway afterwards. So we try to make the manual process as simple as possible and as quick as possible.
We also, one other thing that's worth mentioning here, you'll see a little thumbs up here. We believe that because every place reference is in fact a kind of interpretation, there is no objective standard by which you can ever look at a text and say that there are no more places to be discovered here. All you can do is say that I, as a reader, am not able to establish any more places which are in this particular text. Therefore, I'm fairly confident that we can move on from here. Okay, so here we've got 0. You'll see the little thumbs up. But once I get to the end, okay, I can click on that and I'll get my little thumbs up. And multiple people can do that. So we can actually establish greater confidence as more people look through a text and say, yeah, I've read it too, and I don't think there's any more places that are in there.
And of course, all this, the process of annotation, you can always link back to the people who have been doing the annotating as well. So that kind of record is also there in Recogito. And so, as Leif was saying before, I think we were faced really by 2 challenges. Well, 3 challenges with multiple challenges, there you go, for Pelagios 3. One is, of course, scale, so trying to make things as easy as possible. Faced by the challenge, really, that for the ancient world, we're quite well served by lots of projects already with digitized material already annotated. Once we started moving beyond the ancient world, particularly Islamic and Chinese traditions, much less content online annotated. So we wanted to make that, try and get enough information out there annotated that would then encourage other people to do that. A related problem was the issue of gazetteers. So that with the ancient world, we're very well served by the Pelagios Gazetteer or the Digital Atlas of the Roman Empire. Again, once we moved outside the ancient world, we were struggling with what kind of gazetteers do people use. We'll come back to that shortly. The third issue was we're moving away from the world of texts, where it's quite easy, probably, to annotate place names in materials. And you've got the issue of maps, particularly handwritten maps. So here's a very good example. So this is really one of the key things with Recogito is that you're now able to transcribe place names on maps. So here you have Kipro, and you start typing in Kipro, and what's quite useful now is that you'll get an automatic list of places that were associated with the Gazetteer, and then you can choose which one is most appropriate. So there's also a kind of prompt to help you with the transcription process. And it's just to add, because normally I think Rainer has a kind of screenshot for this. Basically, the whole transcription process is very easy. You do 2 clicks, one here, sorry, 3 clicks, one here, one here, one here, and that produces then a box around the piece of handwriting that you want to annotate. If it's skew width, because you're looking at these places here, you can manipulate the image, you can turn the image around, and again make it nice and straight so that you can do the annotation as simply as possible.
And there's also, you can change brightness and contrast as well. So there's all sorts of tools to facilitate what can at times be quite challenging in terms of identifying a particular topic.
So what we've been talking about so far is the target, as Leif was saying. So making the annotation in the document, whether that's a text or a map. This bit's the body.
Okay, yeah, so we have now a whole bunch of what we might call stub annotations. Okay, we've identified or placed a bunch of references to particular strings of characters, or that either we've identified from the text itself and pulled out, or that we've transcribed ourselves. So the next stage is to figure out what place within a gazetteer is that referring to. So this is the principal page where we can do that. On the left-hand side, we have a big list of all of those places in a sequence. If it's a text, that sequence will be the various places as they occur in the text. So if I go back and start introducing places later on, okay, they'll be inserted into the right sequence. Okay? They're not going to be added on at the end. If it's on a map, then that text, that list itself will typically be based on proximity. Okay? There's an algorithm that more or less uses something like the traveling salesman or something close to traveling salesman algorithm to try and find out what is the closest association between places. Sometimes that's more helpful than others. In particular, if you think of something like a Portland chart where places are being listed on a coastline, that turns out to be really helpful. Okay, so here we've got a big list of those places, and on our right-hand side we've got a map, and here you can see that they're all green, okay, and that's because somebody has gone through and identified for each of those places a particular place within a gazetteer. And down here in the bottom we have some statistics which more or less can be associated with that green and yellow bar that we saw earlier on.
Yeah, we found this particularly helpful with a kind of a map, particularly if you're dealing with, for example, medieval itineraries where you're in the text you're going from one place to another place. Once you visualize that information on a map, it's really easy to see where the places are. And in fact, we're discovering a lot of places that perhaps weren't necessarily even in gazetteers before, and now you can start locating them because you can visualize that information. So this is another aspect that we might want to mention, that the kinds of annotation process that we're enabling here can feed back and make those authority files, the gazetteers themselves, better, both in terms of giving them more information and also giving them information that's located in a particular document. So it gives them a kind of a bibliography as well.
So for the process for the resolution of each of these, okay, is done with a pop-up that's like this. So we've got a base map there. Okay, we can have multiple different base maps. So many of you will be familiar with that, with the Pelagios base map developed here in Alfeld. This one here is an ancient world mapping center. With what we can also do things like Bing satellite and so forth. And Johann's currently producing a series of further base maps based on the places as we extract them from the text themselves. Okay, so that we'll be no longer having to rely for later periods looking at base maps from the contemporary world and the ancient world, but we can actually, as it were, do kind of a Google map, but the places on that Google map will actually have been extracted from geographic texts that are associated, that are relevant to the particular period that you might be analyzing. So number 3 here, so we've got a particular place. You can see here at the top left, Miletus. Number 7 shows us some context around that, so we can see the particular sentences or words that come before this particular reference to Miletus to give us some context.
That might be useful, for example, for disambiguation. If you're dealing with Alexandria, it's useful to know which Alexandria is being mentioned. And if you've got that textual context, you might be able to make a better judgment.
We can also see, although I think here it's obscured by the pop-up, but we've got some kind of grey lines here, but we can also identify where are the two previous, and if we've known the two places after it as well. So if we're looking at an itinerary, we happen to know what comes before and what happens to kind of come afterwards. That's often very helpful in locating the likely region of a place that we're looking at. We do, up at the top, we do have a provisional assignment to a particular place that can help with some initial kind of guesswork about
hence the kind of the gears icon.
So that means automated. So the computer has said, I think this is Miletus, the city in Caria, which in fact in this particular case it is.
And so it initially appear grey. So that means that you've had that automatic, you've made this annotation in the text, either the map or the text, and then there's an automatic association or alignment to a gazetteer, it'll appear grey. It'll only appear green once someone has looked at it. So that's where the person comes in.
So we can do that here with number 6. We have a bunch of different buttons. We can verify that, in which case it will go green, or we can say, no, I want to ignore this, so get rid of it altogether. Or I can say, I don't know, for a number of different reasons. Maybe this place just doesn't seem to exist in any gazetteers. Maybe there are multiple Alexandrias that this could refer to, and I don't want to, bet the farm on it being this particular one. What I can also do down here is do search, so I can type in a string of characters that might be the particular phrase here. It might be a variant on that, so maybe because it's been transformed between Greek and Latin, and I want to explore different ways of expressing the same name. And I can search across multiple gazetteers here, both with a strict search and also with a fuzzy search, and that will give me a whole list of different candidates, again, which will be displayed on the map, and which I can select the one that seems most appropriate to me.
So what's happening there is you get to choose the place from the most appropriate gazetteer from the documents you're working with. So for me, dealing with the ancient world, I'll probably be looking at Pelagios first of all, for this particular place. Past place, which is another gazetteer for the medieval period, also will have a reference to Miletus. Me choosing Miletus, the Pleiades version, is okay though, because there's a connection between the gazetteers as well. So that me asserting this is the Miletus in Pleiades, there's still going to be a connection to the Miletus in past place as well. So you've now in the Pelagios kind of ecosystem, you've now got connections between documents and connections between gazetteers as well.
Two final things that we can do is per reference we can also add comments. So if we're uncertain about something, or we've decided that it's not this place because of some particular clue that we've identified that might not be self-evident, then I can write a note to myself, to anybody else, associated with that annotation. And I can also tag something, and we use tags we think can be especially useful for associating particular classifications, which might not be the kinds of classifications that we find in a gazetteer. It may be really interesting that a particular author from antiquity or the Middle Ages has referred to a particular place in a certain way. The fact that, for example, is referred to as a colonia rather than a municipium might be interesting in a particular context. Okay? Maybe that gives us some clues about the dating, for example. Okay? So there are a variety of different ways in which we can use those tags flexibly, and all of that data, again, can be used for mapping, for statistical analysis.
And we've also discovered it's not really, Recogito isn't really geared, it isn't really set up for this kind of thing, but we started using it anyway. So this is actually aligning a gazetteer. So there's a gazetteer that I was working with people in Athens called Pandectis, a very interesting gazetteer in that it has material. It's basically when Greece became a modern nation state. Lots of places in the Greek territories were either Turkish or Balkan, Slavic. During the process of making this a modern European state, these place names went through changes, and most often the decision was to try to find an ancient Greek term, if there was one. And so there's all this information there, none of it with coordinates, and what we were able to do, and like I said, Recogito isn't really geared to this, but what we were able to do was just to use that file, I think it was a CSV file, just a list of tables, and dump that into Recogito, and immediately people could visualize it. So all this is grey because it hasn't been looked at. But what it instantly enables you to do is to, well, I think quite clearly, is that it shows all of these places around the Greek territories that we could easily imagine. So it was a kind of a shortcut to really introducing into what potentially is a gazetteer, geographic information, the coordinate system.
We think this is going to be really powerful because there are lots and lots of examples like this. Another good example is Portland charts, where scholarship has already produced a significant gazetteer of place references across a wide range of documents. But typically they don't have coordinates. Sometimes that's because they haven't had the time or the resources to add those. Frequently it's because the coordinates for those places are simply not known. But nonetheless, we can take a list like that, we can align it with something more general, like past place, and then on that basis, we can take a document, annotate that with references from an appropriate gazetteer, which doesn't have coordinates, but then use the alignment to the other gazetteers to start that mapping process. Okay? So it's not a perfect system, but it basically means that the associations that we make are much more realistic. We're not always having to take documents, we're not having to take a document which has fairly obscure places and try to map that to a very generic gazetteer on the one hand. We can associate it with the right kind of gazetteer that's well suited to the purpose, but we don't have to give up, in the process of doing that, the potential that mapping can also provide. As well as, I should also say, all of the other annotations which are connected to other gazetteers. Okay, so by bridging the alignment process between gazetteers means that I can map a medieval document to the reference of Rome in past place. Elton can map a classical document to a reference to Rome and Pelagios, and because those places have an alignment, we can actually bridge between those without having to enforce anybody, without having to take our classical documents and map them to past place as well, and take our medieval documents and map them to Pelagios as well. Okay, so to a certain degree, we can have our cake and eat it as well.
So what we've been talking about for the last probably 20 minutes is the inside of Recogito, the nuts and bolts, the login, keys to the kingdom. What we are going to show you now is some things you can do with that information. Why are we bothering annotating documents? So this is one of the things that you can see just by in that, if you remember that first screen that we showed you of Recogito, there was the view map. So you click on that button for Homer's Odyssey and you view a map of all the places that Homer mentions. Of course, we're dealing here with Homer's real geography and not the fantastical geography of Odysseus' narrative, which is another story entirely. And what you have here is you can click on any of these places and it brings up, again, that link to the original document, the text. So this is Phaistos, and you get the Gazetteer entry, you can see where Phaistos is, and you also have the kind of text snippet of where Phaistos is. And this is actually quite a useful way to go. So you have buttons here left and right, and you can click to see what the next place is. So you start getting a sense maybe of movement, either geographically or, I think perhaps most interesting, is movement through the text and seeing what places are sequenced by Homer. This is particularly powerful, I think, for visualizing Homer's catalogue of ships, for example, and getting a sense in the Iliad of the kinds of places that Homer is talking about there in this kind of catalogue.
It's also, to remember, each of these points is also an annotation, okay? So, or maybe even multiple annotations. So in each case, we can also link back to the original document, okay? Not just the snippet here, but we can actually link back to the particular text of the map where that might be online, or we can link back to a particular place, and we're going to come to this in a moment, a site that will tell us all of the other documents that we're aware of, which refer to that place as well. Okay, so there's two quite powerful kinds of search, so we can kind of do that. We mentioned before that we could do downloads, so we can download each of these annotations themselves as CSV. We can compare things together, so this is a kind of a fun comparison between the Bordeaux itinerary, which is one that starts in Bordeaux in Gaul, about 331 AD rather. It goes down to Jerusalem and then comes back again. And here we have the Vicarella goblets, which start in Gades in Iberia, work their way up and then down to Rome. And one of the interesting things, I think there is a tendency for us to look at Roman road networks and think of this as a kind of a network where there's sort of a Brownian motion and people move around this stuff in any which way. But in fact, actually, if we start looking at particular itineraries, we do frequently sort of see people moving around that network in ways which are not necessarily geographically, spatially, obvious. Now, if you happen to know which the main Roman road networks are, then traveling along the Via Aemilia and the Via Flaminia is not terribly surprising, but it is interesting that we have that kind of persistence with those places right up until the Lombards kind of move in, and then everything changes really kind of quite radically. Other things that we can do, so one of the things we're very aware of is that we don't want to create a scenario where people are moved from and only start thinking about particular places according to, as it were, a modern geodetic Google world slippy map view. So we can take those annotations, and not only do we record, if we're annotating different kinds of maps, non-geodetic maps or maps that use non-standardized projections, things like Portland charts are a good example. It's something that looks kind of like the Mediterranean, but if you tie it to rubber sheet, you'll find that there's actually all sorts of interesting things which are going on. For each annotation, if it's from an image, we also record the coordinates of where it is on that particular image. And that means we can do the reverse. We can actually take that image, bring it into a GIS, take that same set of coordinate data, and then reproject it back into and on top of a particular map. Okay, so here we have, so this is not using a regular projection, this is just a portal chart incorporated into a GIS, but taking the various places which have been identified here and tying them back in. And again, we can make those interactive links or explore those in different kinds of ways. Okay, so we're not tied to only thinking about this data as though it was only in a kind of Google map worldview.
I think there are maybe two other things briefly to mention. First of all, you have symbols as well as places, and being able to overlay the portal and chart with modern technology through means like this, you can maybe start making sense of medieval symbology and what precisely these red dots mean, for example. Another thing to say is that many people have been working on geo-rectification of old maps. This is, if you like, one added bonus of working with Pelagios, is that you get this kind of geo-rectification just through this means as well. So you don't have to do any other, you don't have to do geo-rectification on top of this.
Yeah, absolutely. If we have something with a dense matrix of places, georeferencing, as it were, can come for free, because we actually have every single place acts, if you will, as a control point as well. So Pelagios, we've been developing various kind of APIs and services that again enable people to exploit this data in various ways. Here's something that we like to refer to as bottomless maps, mostly because deep maps are so trendy these days. We had to did a bit of one-upmanship here. We call them bottomless maps basically because we can generate heat maps that you can click on, and as people produce more annotations within the Pelagios cloud, and that link to the references themselves increases through time, if you like. So it's a kind of future-proofing, if you will. It's not a single controlled data set that's published and then, no matter how big and complex, it's actually organically growing over time.
So for example, there are 940 references when this slide was made. Probably now there are going to be 1,000 references to DLOS, so it's continually growing, this map.
We click on that link, we can bring up an API here or a particular a screen which will associate with that place, tell us which kinds of data sets. And remember, because Pelagios has been going for some time, it's not just early geographic documents, but a whole range of other kinds of resources besides. And it will give us direct links into each of those resources to the particular site and the particular reference to that particular place. So we're probably running out of time here a little bit. We okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Yeah.
5-10 minutes-ish.
Cool. Great. Pelagios is intended to be decentralized. That's one of the most kind of fundamental goals that we're trying to achieve here. So we want to make it as easy as possible for people to incorporate this kind of information within their own websites following annotation. So here are some examples of ways in which people can do that. So at the top, there's the Heidelberg Ethnographic Database. If you go to a particular record, and that you will have a link here, which will have content from the Pelagios network associated with a place that is either mentioned or where that particular description is found. Bottom left here is for the ISOR papers, so the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World's House Journal. There's a very nice pop-up that has been developed by Nick Binovitz and Sebastian Heath. So if you mouse over a place reference within one of their particular articles, then you will automatically, you don't have to click on anything, you'll automatically get this pop-up here, the little map that shows you where that place is, gives you a blurb, and gives you links into Pelagios. Open Context here on the right-hand side by Eric and Sarah Kanza is a repository of archaeological information, and again, by identifying particular places where finds might come from, or where a particular archaeological site is, they can draw out from our API and automatically kind of produce a dialog box here which gives you links into all of the different resources that refer to that place.
We could probably skip over this quite quickly. I think this is because we've been working on these different geographic traditions. We can collate all that information, kind of the big data view, if you like, and just get a kind of snapshot of the spatial depth and breadth of all of those documents. And so we're looking at the Greek tradition here, mapped in a kind of heat map, so the hotter the signal, the more annotations there are. There's a kind of timeline here too, and the places, the most frequently mentioned places within that corpus of documents. No surprise, Sparta, Athens, Thebes at the top. That kind of shows us that we're doing the job right, at least. And then this is kind of the new stuff. So the last 5 minutes will be kind of hot off the plate, and then we could tell you some things, but then we'd have to lock the door. But we'll do the best we can.
So what this is? So this is a new, effectively a new kind of search engine that's been developed by Ryan called Pelagios. New API and associated interface.
I come up with names. You know, that's my job.
Search interface. Part of what this is trying to deal with is one of the points that people have brought up for a long time about Pelagios, and of course have been right, which is that there's a peculiar distribution of place references. So what typically every team says, oh, let's look for Athens. And of course they look for Athens and they wind up engulfed with this vast quantity of information associated with a particular place. Now, obviously, there are an awful lot of other places which might only have a much smaller number of place references to them, and that's kind of useful too. But nonetheless, we do absolutely take on board that question of the fact that many people do want to look at particularly well-known places, and for them, Pelagios has somewhat underserved them because there really is that kind of massive deluge. So there's a kind of two-pronged approach here to dealing with that. Part of it has been an expansion, the slight expansion of the annotation model, so that we can incorporate information like temporal, the temporal association of annotation, and we can also have some kinds of faceting as well. We can, as well as bringing in additional content. So, insofar as people who are producing those annotations introduce that extra information into their annotations, we can also then enrich our search, and currently that's happening. In fact, so currently with the API, we're both revamping lots of data that was there before and encouraging people who have previously added data into Pelagios to update their data where necessary. And we're also developing the API to make better use of that improved information. So here, for example, we can see somebody has selected Pompeii. We have some information about the particular gazetteers that it's associated with. Okay, so we know that from the alignments which are there. We can look at all the annotations, and we can give ourselves a sense of what are the kind of the temporal periods which are associated with those particular annotations. And again, we can filter on that if we want to. We can look at the types of kind of reference here. So whether they are the annotation is to a particular item, or it's a reference that comes from a place, or whether it's from the place it's just a reference to the place itself. And we can also filter based on the particular source of those things. There's a variety of different ways of increasing or minimizing the particular content that it's referring to. We can also start to do free text search. This is something that we couldn't do before. So previously, you could search for a particular place, and now you can search for elephants. And you can say, show me places which co-occur. Now this is string search, it's not semantic search. We need to be kind of very clear about that. Okay, but show me places which occur in conjunction with the word elephant, for example, and see how many hits you get for Carthage, for example. But we can really look for anything at all. And actually, we've been so far pleasantly surprised by how well this works. It turns out to be kind of surprisingly interesting. Now, like Google, of course, it's not going to give you some kind of perfect, comprehensive result, but nonetheless, it is something that can be quite interesting to see where we do get those kinds of associations with where particular kinds of words are associated with particular kinds of words.
And again, you've got the visualization on the map, and on the heat mapping, you've got the timeline at the bottom here, and then of course you've got the links to the actual annotations themselves, the documents.
And we can also do this very briefly, but we can look for a particular kind. Again, we've got that faceted browsing, so we can search for things across a particular category of information if we happen to have that as well. Again, generate heat maps automatically. Okay, so the nice thing is it isn't all kind of pre-processed, but we can generate that stuff on the fly.
And very quickly you see the itineraries of the medieval period there. You can go back and think about the different footprints of the different geographical traditions. So at the top left, you've got what we call the ancient Greek geographical tradition, the Roman or Latin geographical tradition, and you can put them alongside each other. you get a sense perhaps not so much that the Roman kind of knowledge base expands that much further, particularly to the east than the Greeks, but what happens, of course, is the fleshing out of detail, and particularly moving west there to Gaul. So that's kind of trying to get the kind of the bigger picture of all the documents in the Pelagios system. Here's a kind of neat specific example. This was working with Klaus Goetz of the Freie Universität in Berlin. So
what you're saying about Pelagios 4, the purpose of Pelagios 4 is to actually exploit some of this for scholarship.
That's a good point. And so Klaus had been working on looking at all measurement data in the ancient world, and he kind of produced this hand-derived database of when people had given measurements in ancient sources, in ancient Greek and Latin sources. And by bringing him into and bringing that data into the Pelagios network, of course, one thing instantly we could do was to visualize it. So here we have places that are connected on the left-hand side with Gades and on the right-hand side to Alexandria. And this is quite interesting in terms of looking at least two different ways in which you can start interpreting the data here. For example, with Alexandria here on the right-hand side, what you get a sense of is perhaps Alexandria's networks, the kind of real-life networks of Alexandria, the places associated, for example, along the Nile, or the coastline here, kind of all places around the Mediterranean. So you get a sense of the network that Alexandria is very much a part of in the Mediterranean. On the left-hand side, which is Gades, places mentioned in association with Gades, something different seems to be happening. You do get a sense, perhaps with Gades and Corsica, that there's a kind of a network, a kind of trade network there. But then you notice on the far left, and way over here on the right, you might not notice in the Black Sea, you're getting a sense there perhaps of the conceptual boundaries of the ancient world. So when you talk about Gades, it's often in association with the Palace of Heracles on the left, and right over to the far east corner of the Black Sea. So you get a sense of the conceptual apparatus. So this is quite interesting. You've got the conceptual apparatus on the left, kind of more economic or political apparatus on the right-hand side. So you can start using these patterns to explore kind of different questions. Last two slides, and we couldn't leave you without at least a couple of spaghetti monsters. So here's one of them. This is looking at a kind of all the places associated, kind of networked together in a particular text. So places mentioned in the same breath, kind of connected together. Right at the centre here is Ithaca, so there's no prizes for guessing what text this is referring to, but it's quite useful again in terms, for us, to showing that the kind of the data is working, the kind of the model is working. So you can see all places really do lead back to Ithaca in the Odyssey. And then this was, I think, taken probably around Christmas time, when we were only working at that point with the Greek, Latin and Byzantine traditions. The whole network of this Pelagios 3 early geospatial documents. So the green symbols here are the Greek tradition, the red are the Latin tradition, the purple is the Byzantine tradition. So you get a sense of where the particular traditions are intersecting, where they're a little bit different. I just want to draw attention to two aspects. That is this kind of purple dot there that seems to be in between the Greek and Latin for some reason, a bit unusual, and then over to the left-hand side, a kind of series of purple dots of the Byzantine tradition, somehow different from each other. Well, when we looked at this further, we discovered that purple dot in between the traditions was a Suda. So again, thankfully, things are working. The Suda consciously, of course, evoking the past, the Greek and Latin traditions of places. And if we look to that other corner, where things seem to be a little bit different, we're talking about pilgrimages. So again, a sense that what you do, of course, with this kind of big data like this, I think is a big challenge, and I think it's something that we're all going to have to be exploring further. But at least this is kind of a proof for things actually working in our system, that things are being annotated, and that being able to visualize this material now can lead to something.
Yeah, one final example here of research. So some of you will know that Richard Talbot read a book, Rome's World, was specifically about the Putea map, and he had a theory that perhaps the centrality or not of Rome would be very significant in terms of our interpretation of this as a document. There's been a lot of speculation. Is this an image that is intended, that was conceptualized and is intended to be perceived as a whole, in which case it would make sense for Rome to be absolutely central to that composition, or is it something that we look at in parts, that is, as it were, a kind of roll and look at specific sections.
So there isn't the conception, the broader conception of all the material together.
So unfortunately, it's very difficult for us to know that, because the western end of the Peutinger map is famously missing. There's been a reconstruction by Miller that was just of a single parchment sheet here. So Talbot's thesis was perhaps that really should be much longer. Perhaps there should be 3 rather than just 1. But what evidence can we bring to bear on that? How can we possibly show it? Well, by comparing places, it turns out that maybe there is some significant evidence here. If we look at two specific texts, the Gazetteer Geographica and the Ravenna Cosmography, both of them have a particular single itinerary, which is a terrestrial, the coastal itinerary that follows the coastline of the entire Mediterranean and the Black Sea coast. It starts at Ravenna and then works its way anti-clockwise all the way around and back again. There's about 850 locations, all of which are more or less a day's walk from one another. If we compare that list, so if we compare the Gazetteer Geographica and the Ravenna Cosmography, we find that those lists are more or less identical. There are certainly a few areas, lacunae and so forth, but essentially that itinerary is very clearly the same itinerary. If we compare that itinerary with the Peutinger table, then we also find that overwhelmingly, that same itinerary is also represented. There are a few patches, in particular the north coast of the Black Sea, the run between the Maritime Alps and the Pyrenees, the south coast of Asia Minor as well, and Dalmatia, where that's not the case. But otherwise, pretty much place for place, and here's a stretch that you can compare them, you can see that exactly those same places are referred to one after the other. So if we take those places and we look about the places which are missing in the Peutinger table, we look at there and we figure out, well, how many places in that itinerary are missing? Okay, and we look at that for the south coast of Iberia, and we compare that for the northwest coast of Africa, and we spread those places out according to the same level of spacing as we find in the extant sheets as well, then indeed we find that for that to really make sense, unless we assume that a whole bunch of those places are missing, or that we assume that those places are all subtly crammed together, okay, then yes, indeed, we probably would need another 3 sheets here, which gives some serious credence, I think, to Talbot's theory that Rome really is likely to be central to this entire composition, and therefore we need to sort of see that as a conceptual whole.
Maybe we should pass over this.
No, I think it's just worth mentioning we got some funding from the Open Knowledge Foundation, DM2E, to trial Recogito with students. We did that at Tufts University, Mainz University in Heidelberg, and they really enjoyed it. We had a mixture of students from classics, computing, from Islamic studies as well, and they've really got a lot out of it, and they produced 15,000 edits in the course of just a few hours. So again, if this is the sort of thing that you think if you have students, if you are undergraduate or postgraduate students who might be interested, then let us know, because yeah, we've certainly found that they seem to enjoy it, and it's a great way for us both to generate data and also to figure out what works for people and whatever. And last of all, so Pelagios really, and all of this is just part of, as many of you will be aware, a much wider ecosystem that's developing of linked data that's associating documents together with conceptual entities. And those might be places, as we've been doing with Pelagios, but it might be also people, so for example, SNAP, it might be periods, so the periods organized project, and a variety of other different kinds of concept schemes. We're beginning to bring that stuff together in all sorts of interesting and exciting ways. And I think that the huge benefits of this is that we almost always find that things become much more interesting than the sum of their parts. That the more of this stuff that kind of links together, actually the more that we can do. So if you're interested in any of this, there's a workshop called Link Pass. It's 20th and 21st of July. There are still just some tickets available on Eventbrite. So yeah, give us a shout or sign up.
Free reception.
And a free reception as well. So you can't say fairer than that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, floor is now open to questions, and also we are still streaming live to the world, and if the world is listening, it can tweet questions to the DigiClass hashtag, and we will endeavour to analogize them here in the room. So, but in the meantime, floor's open to questions. I have lots, but Charlotte.
I like the reference to the real places in Homer, as distinguished from the unreal places in Homer. And I'm having a bit of difficulty. So some of your examples, I think particularly one was annotating text that in English, but also in the original Greek. What does the toponym Miletus mean? The lands of Miletus was the reference that you have there. And Athens, Sparta, Rome, I mean, how do we, are you collecting toponyms or places?
Yeah, I think, and in some ways this is one of the reasons for introducing things like tags and comments, so that we can start to filter, we can start, I think what we started, we have a series of guidelines we kind of built in to try and, especially over the course of the Pelagios 3 project, identify certain kinds of things that we would think of even as places and some, or as the kind of things that we would reference and the kinds of things we would. To give an example, ethne are probably kind of a good one. There are times when we are referring to something in a geographic, effectively as a geographic proxy. Okay? So we might say, the Goths or the Alemanni are over the Danube. Okay? And in that particular context, what we really mean is the territory of this particular group is across the Danube. In other cases, we might say the Goths and Alemanni crossed the Danube, and in that case, we are not referring to them as a geographic concept. We are actually referring to them, as a large body of people heading our way, or the way of the particular, the author as it might be. So we have attempted to do some of that, but we also have to accept that the way in which something like Recogito can be used is potentially very flexible. And I think this is probably why we would want to use things like tagging and faceting ultimately as a mechanism to try and distinguish between it, rather than just, by diktat say only this kind of reference or that kind of reference can work. And there's going to be some, and also because some of it is just fuzzy. The lands of Miletus versus Miletus. We had with Hesse, we had quite a few cases. Islands in particular, it was often unclear: is it the city, is it the physical feature of the island, or is it the territory of the city that happens to be coextensive with the island itself that were being referred to? And in each of those cases, a physical feature, territory, or settlement, it could be an interpretation of any of those three kinds of things in a given case.
That's another reason why we use that traffic light system, so that you're not saying that this is a place, but you're making an assertion. So it's kind of a claim that
interpretive act.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why, it's good that you pick that up. So with the example of Miletus, you also have that text snippet, so it gives you that context. So at least you have a sense, even if it's been marked up as a toponym by perhaps somebody else, you would then at least be able to see and make a judgment for yourself whether you think this is correct in this particular instance, depending on what you're looking at.
It's this sense, what's in my mind is that the ancient tendency to refer to a community as by the genitive plural of its people, or by its people rather than as the place. So perhaps what's in their head? When you talk about the Milesians, what do you mean?
That's a great point, and we really, as Leif has already mentioned, we discovered that on the Hesse project. Particularly the difference between, if you're looking at the English text, which we were doing, and the Greek and the Greek text. And what was particularly interesting there, we're using the English text because it was marked up, and so it was quicker for us to do and to visualize. And often in the English text you would have the place names given. So yes, places, so Miletus and Athens, and then you look at the Greek text and the people, the ethni, are being used. But what was interesting there was that most cases, not all cases, most cases, when you looked at those cases where you had that difference between the Greek ethni and the English toponym, the English translation was trying to actually captured something about how those ethni were being used. So as Leif was saying, in a geographic context rather than in another kind of context. So although the English translation was not accurate in that particular sense, it was giving an indication, I think, perhaps more of an indication of the inherent spatial qualities of some ways in which the ethnoi are being used, and indeed individuals are being used too. So, for example, Darius being used as a kind of as a proxy for Persia, for example. But this is all really to say that your question is spot on, and it's something I think we do have to worry about. I think it's quite important, particularly when you're aggregating data like this, that you allow people working on it to make those decisions, and afterwards also when people are using this material to see what decisions have been made, so that you can come with it, so you're aware at least of where the data are coming from and what kinds of interpretive acts have been made of them. So try and make things as transparent as possible.
Institute of Historical Research seminars here when they're talking about the mass digitization projects. Yes, you can't just randomly dive in there and expect to get what you want out of it. It is a question of, well, what is your original source data, what processing has it gone through, and what interpretive acts have actually gone into it in the first place, what's been included, what's been omitted. You're not suffering from the OCR problems that they suffer from, but there's another layer of issues on top of that side of the data research. We hear it all the time from that.
We definitely have OCR. So some of the things we're working from are OCR, and we definitely have some of the issues. Yeah, we also have issues. Yeah.
I'm just having this ongoing Twitter discussion with Rainer, but being a man, I can only do one thing at a time. So I'll just ask the question.
He's not asking questions, is he?
No, I'm asking the question. He's answering them, but I'd like to hear your answer as well.
Yeah.
It's about place objects which have kind of significance in terms of places. I mean, you brought up the example of Phaistos, and one time in my life I was a Bronze Age person, so when I think of Phaistos, I think of the Phaistos disc, and a lot of the literature I dealt with, was talking about the Phaistos disc, with the place essentially as an attribute of the object. And if I understand the tweets that Rainer's sending me correctly, I mean, essentially if you have a URI which refers to the object, like in a museum catalogue, you could use Pelagios to kind of bring in that URI as well. But I mean, what in general would be your approach for places which have a particular significance in terms of objects? Can you say any more about that? I suppose the same goes for people. I mean, there's the Herodotus Pelegonesus question as well. I mean, how do you deal with non-place entities in this ecosystem?
Oh, so you mean in general? I think that's a very wide and open question. So we should say that certainly Pelagios has taken a focus of how can we contribute to that ecosystem by focusing on place, if you like, and we're certainly very engaged in conversations with people who are looking at periods, looking at people, and so on. But we probably want to be careful about making grand proclamations about how those groups should do particular things, because we, to some degree, we're quite happy to defer to their wisdom and make use of the resources that they provide. In terms of linking places to people and periods and so on, I think that's still. I think we're to some degree still where we were with Pelagios 1 and 2, which is that we want to, in a kind of cookbook collaborative way, try and figure, if you had, let's say, have a museum inventory database, and you've got all your content and it's all linked to some kind of table of places there, then there may be multiple ways in which that you can do that annotation process. So you might want to download this as a spreadsheet, and then just kind of do some kind of mapping to Pleiades. One of the great things about Recogito, however, is that you can actually take a CSV file. So I think that's probably going to be one of the ways in which that's going to be a big step forward. So that if people have a database, they can take that and then do the mapping that way, re-export it, and then they've got that mapping for themselves. But I don't think, we should be kind of clear, Recogito is mostly dedicated to dealing with tables, we're doing text and doing images, and it probably, in terms of individual references to Herodotus, scattered out there on the web, if you will, we're still some way from being able to do that. And in that case, we probably need things like Hypothesis or other kinds of systems for web annotation, I would suspect. If that answers your question.
But you had the museum database from which we got the data, which wasn't visualized geographically, am I right? So what's visualised geographically is the ancient source, but not the modern situation of the object.
So here, in this particular case, this is something that Ryan has generated. So I'm probably, we should probably tweeting Ryan or asking to, to kind of jump in here. But essentially, what this is going to be referring to here is what's in the system. So if it will depend entirely on whether the museum has produced annotations for the find spot or the minting spot of a particular place, or both. Of course, they might want to do both of those things. There is obviously clearly no way that Recogito or Pelagios can fill in gaps which have been left by the particular contributors themselves.
So my follow-on question is, can we, what I'm interested in, Charlotte knows why I'm asking this, is can we visualise a site beyond the site now? Can we visualise the modern location of the bits of the site? So this is more relevant to architecture than objects that we theorise in manufacturing place. But if we, for example, if you were mapping the Parthenon, you would be mapping this place. So can you map a modern site as it has been dispersed? Is it possible to engineer that if you're not?
Yeah. So one of the things that we haven't done yet, but we're very excited by the possibilities of. So certainly the gazetteers that we've been looking at until recently were effectively Pleiades. They were based on settlements. And it's still the case that most of the gazetteers that we use are effectively about settlements. But there is nothing about a gazetteer itself that has to be about settlements. And there are plenty of examples where you might have a gazetteer, you think of the London A to Z or whatever it is. Okay? So we could take gazetteers of Rome or Athens or a particular site. And as long as you've got the map will enable you to kind of zoom in at any level. So we've had some conversations already, although we haven't made much in the way of direct progress yet, about can we start tying things to individual temples in the forum, the Roman forum. Technologically, absolutely no problem at all. In terms of the only question is just about gazetteers and being able to kind of project that onto a map of the correct scale.
So it'd be kind of the same principle. So just as you'd have a URI, at the minute we have URIs for places, and that's how we make the connections. You could have URIs for particular temples or other buildings within that particular place, and it would just be another layer.
Yeah, and you could align, of course, all of those locations just to the Pleiades entry for Rome or Athens or whatever it was. So you could have the best of both worlds. You can both treat that as this is stuff found in this city, or you can say this is stuff found in a particular place. And again, the great thing is you don't have to know where places are. So if you don't know where a particular temple is, you can still associate it with that. You can still do all your statistical analysis. But obviously you can't put it on a map because you don't know where that particular location is.
And to be honest, I think this is definitely something that's needed, and it should be the next step, because there's just so much information. We're still overwhelmed by Athens and Rome, the obvious sites, and you'd want some further layer of granularity to be able to drill down into these sites and see which particular buildings were associated with each other within particular places. So I think having URIs for individual buildings within particular settlements is something that, we're in conversation with various people about.
The other end of the scale, also reminds me, because we didn't talk about it, is regionalization. So obviously most of the focus here, as you've seen again, most of the gazetteers for historical reasons have point coordinates associated with places. But there are lots of things like provinces, or for that matter, the footprint of a particular settlement, which could also, not necessarily, there is not a right or a wrong here, but also be represented by geometries like polygons. You might have the course of a river, just signified by a line. So we've already started that with using some of the because we already have some geometry files for Hadrianic provinces, if you will, or the provinces from Diocletian in the late antiquity. So we've been able to take those, convert those, and then also start to be able to kind of show those on the map as well. And one of the really interesting things that sometimes kind of comes about is because some of these things have temporal bounds, we can associate them with a particular province associated with a particular time. If you look at our example online for the Pelagian map, then you'll actually find that in one particular case, we actually have two overlapping provinces. And the reason for those being overlapping is they're actually from two separate periods of history. So it's not because the geometry is wrong, it's actually because the Pelagian map is referring to two places that never coexisted at the same time. So doing that kind of thing can actually have some kind of interesting benefits in flagging up, if you will, interesting things about those documents. And the same thing, of course, could go for text as well. So we've got some of those geometries. There's some work to be done in introducing those for, say, for rivers and stuff like that. Again, if anyone's interested in volunteering, let us know.
That's the point where there's silence. Any further questions? I have one. Sorry. Sorry.
Why are we back? Why? Ask us.
Well, just provinces. I mean, because I don't believe any map.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
So
yeah.
I want to be able to see a province solely in, or a diocese or whatever, solely in terms of the places which are said to be in it.
Right.
Because I'm never going to know about the edges, or very rarely am I going to know about the edges.
I think that's absolutely a kind of a fair point. And one of the projects I would love to do, looking forwards actually, would be in terms of identifying references to places on the edges of particular provinces, so that rather than worrying about saying, well, what is the proper geometry of this thing, and actually trying to kind of actually starting to accumulate the particular references that say, the northern edge of this particular province is defined by the river so-and-so. Things like that might at least kind of give us a more descriptive and perhaps, I want to be wary of the word accurate, but at least something, a more nuanced perspective perhaps on the footprint of the provinces.
We're talking about conceptual mapping, and I think that'd be much more interesting than we impose these kind of artificial boundaries. And we're doing this all the time, of course, with the ancient evidence. And so I think that's a really nice idea of using the settlements that I mentioned and really building up a picture from the ground up.
Yes. I'm sure that's the right way. You could do it with the bishops' lists. There are a lot of those late antique lists would lend themselves to that.
Right. And we do find that there are just some cases with things like rivers that if you're tracing an itinerary that crosses a river 500 miles from the river mouth, and it's the river mouth that's been identified by the point coordinate for obvious reasons, it's just a kind of jarring and not terribly helpful kind of representation. So we don't want to say that a geometry is right or wrong, just simply that in some contexts it can be useful.
I mean, in some ways it could be a means of investigating the history of cartography rather than the history of place. Because, I mean, just to take Cyprus as a completely random example, if you look at some of the 16th, particularly the 16th, some of the 15th century maps like Petrus Bertius and so forth, you actually find that the Troodos Mountains are depicted in such a way as to trace the boundaries of the Venetian provinces, not the other way around.
Right.
So, and actually that leads on to the fairly specific question I was going to ask, which was about this. You showed the example of capturing Kypros. Does that image have to, what sort of pre-processing does that image have to go through? Does it have to be auto-rectified, or is it just raster digitalization?
Yeah, raster digitalization is absolutely fine. Yep.
Okay.
That's all we need.
So it's just like encoded as... Simon.
Very quickly, won't be long, promise, but a few times we've heard the speakers refer to the Hestia project, the earlier project that went on before this, the one on Herodotus. And if you want to find out more about that, if you go and have a look at the DigiClass seminar pages, there's a recording of a talk you two gave 3 years ago. 3 years ago.
Leif had hair then.
No,
he didn't.
No. But you'll find an audio recording and slides of that there. But even better, another shameless plug, an earlier edited volume by Gabriel and myself, Digital Research and Study of Classical Antiquity, actually have a paper on that published in that. And although the book is in all good libraries, you will find it freely available online if you go to the STOA website. And I think, Leif, it's in your repository, I think.
Right.
There's a link to that. If you go to the STOA webpage and search for the publication,
and it's in the BICS as
you'll
well.
find, it's in everywhere. You've got that one on there. But I did have a question, and that is, I love conceptual maps. My students will tell you sometimes that I love some nice conceptual maps. And what we heard about was a lot of cases where you were saying your conceptual maps are validating your expectations of the data that's being fed in there. So my question is,
I wonder where this is going.
Did you find something interesting that you weren't expecting that perhaps altered your perception? Okay, let me put it more simply. Did you find anything you really weren't expecting to find?
I think that's difficult to ask at this point because we've been so interested in, our focus has been on getting this stuff done. The actual reflective process and going back and looking at stuff is something that really hasn't been our focus. I guess I would say that some of the examples that we've given, like with Klaus's, for example, what he came up with here, I mean, it's trying to play games with patterns. You try to identify what's going on here. So it wasn't necessarily evident to us from the material that we were getting from Klaus, his measurement data, that the reference to Gazetteer and Alexandria and the places related to these places were different kind of frameworks. Like I was saying before, you get more of a conceptual framework on the left, and this is perhaps more of a kind of economic framework. This is something that you have to kind of think about and try to make sense with the evidence that's available. So I guess that was kind of a surprise. And this was when we had this map too. Looking at the kind of the purple dot there in the middle, was we were wondering what was going on there. So we then discover it's pseudo, and then that makes sense. Anything further than that, I don't think we've really had time to investigate, and I guess this is again an appeal for people to start getting involved and doing their unpicking themselves. And I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff that we're not expecting.
For any bit, I mean, really, we are swimming in information here. There is just so much kind of exciting stuff. So if any of you are interested in ancient or medieval geography, kind of conceptualizations of geography, or even indeed just how your own research relates to geography, let us know. There is so much more here that we can, in lifetimes actually kind of deal with as research agendas for ourselves. That there's epic quantities of interesting things. So please do get in touch.
We have a lot of interest in linked data and big data projects in our centre, as you know. Unfortunately, it's the end of term now. It's the end of the
yes.
But for next year, we have to run something.
Great, that'd be great.
That seems a pretty good note to wind up the formal proceedings on. So we'll thank our presenters very much.